Hey, what's up, guys? Hey, good to be back with you again. Have you ever wondered like how to find what the best pennant races of all time are? Have you ever wondered if there is some sort of scientific way to measure kind of one season's pennant race against another? And additionally, have you ever wondered questions about things like, are the best teams of all time really the teams that dominate their league, or is it better for a team to show its greatness by playing really well through a tight pennant race? This is the sort of stuff that I think a lot about, probably more than I really should. Actually, it's probably not so healthy for me to think about it so much. And so, fortunately for us, there are different tools that people have come up with to measure this stuff. One that I like a lot is called the Championship Leverage Index, which we can find on Baseball Reference. This is another one of these ideas that comes through the research of Tom Tango. Now, you know me. I mean, I've talked a little bit about my disdain for certain parts of modern sabermetrics and parts that I consider to be a little bit strange and a little bit unwieldy. However, for the most part, Tom Tango's research is actually really good and is really easy to follow. Back in the good old days, I actually had a copy of his book, The Book, that I bought right after it came out. I was in college at the time. That I read through and was interested about to a certain extent, except, of course, I was always wondering how in the world a manager managing a game knows exactly what his player's WOBA is. But that's another question for another time. One of the nice things that's come out of looking at the value of every single play in every single situation and looking at what the percentage values are is that you can kind of look into the plays that take place over the course of a game and easily figure out what the most clutch or what the most important plays were, as opposed to what other maybe not so important plays were. This gives you an idea of win probability added and win probability lost if you're the team on the losing edge. That's a much better measure of this thing that we consider to be like clutch hitting or clutch play than something like, I don't know, game-winning RBI. So before we talk about like how this is calculated, let's take a quick look and sort of see what we can learn from it. Again, we're just going to look at my screen. You can look this up yourself in Baseball Reference. I'm not doing anything really fancy. Go over to schedule and results. We'll look for 4 different teams, and it'll show you sort of the differences here. We'll look, of course, at the 27 Yankees first. So if you want to play around with this, if you go over here to their schedule screen, you go click on CLI. That's Championship Leverage Index. It will tell you right here that it measures the importance of each game that the team played on the team's probability of winning the World Series. The average importance will be a score of 1. So anything above 1 is above average. Anything below 1 is below average. Looking at this will give you an idea of what these games are like, right? So these games in early June for the Yankees, which shows how dominant they were, had a CLI of around 7, which means that they were pretty important in terms of winning the pennant. The other games as we go along here are like maybe late June or maybe in late May and so on and so forth, and it goes down in importance. And of course, as we go down the list to the games with 0 importance, this is all after the Yankees have either clinched the pennant or have basically clinched the pennant, right? They're up 14, 15, 16, 17 games, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, I mean, the games in late September and October were completely meaningless because the Yankees had long since won the pennant. Of course, they still won in those games that didn't matter so much. It would be interesting to study this and take a look and see how these teams do in high and low leverage game situations. What you will notice, and what I've been thinking about actually for years, ever since I first read about this in the Hardball Times, is, hey, if we were using this type of approach, I wonder if teams that had their high leverage games earlier in the season were teams that were not involved in pennant races, and that seems to be the case, right? So we'll look first at a really, really bad team, right? The 1941 Philadelphia Phillies. They went 43 and 111. I know about this team because my dad had the old 41 APBA set, right? And you could play with this. This was always the fun team to play with because I think they had an all-D pitching staff, right? So you could use them as sort of like a goldfish if you know Magic the Gathering terminology. Anyway, so what does it look like for a team like this when we arrange it by their championship leverage index? Well, all of their high leverage games are in April, like at the beginning of the season. If your highest leverage games are at the beginning of the season, you probably have a really, really bad team. And you'll see here that most of their games have a leverage of 0 because they were out of the pennant race like really, really early on. In fact, when you get down to 0, I think all of this is in chronological order. So by June 21st, they were completely out of the pennant race. They had no chance of winning the pennant. They were 23 and a half games out, right? Only 17 and 41, so mathematically, they theoretically had a chance, but it's not really happening, right? So that's the way to look at this for teams that are really, really bad. Now let's look at teams that were in a close pennant race and see if sort of our idea holds out or not. The 51 Giants are interesting We know what happened in 1951, right? They went down big, and you can see this just looking at their schedule. Man, they had this huge losing streak, and we're not playing well from the beginning of the season. We go click on the CLI. Their biggest game was, of course, against the Brooklyn Dodgers. This 83.33 rating, I think, is the highest CLI score for any game in history. I'm pretty sure, a regular season game, that is. Because of the magnitude that was involved with that game. But there's an interesting thing that we notice when we look through this. So we see all of these key games in late September, early October. And then right here in the middle is this doubleheader with the Dodgers in July that, of course, the Giants lost. And then there are a couple of games from September, some from June, some from July. What I believe that's telling us is that the Giants had this big period of being out of the pennant race after July and then didn't really come back into it until September, right? And that's the reason why you're kind of seeing these months sort of divided out in that fashion. Now let's look at a different team, the 1987 Detroit Tigers, who barely won the pennant over the Blue Jays, who were in the running for most of the season. When we look at their schedule and results and arrange it by CLI, what we see is, again, the big games were those games against Toronto at the end of the season and also in September. But the other big games that we see here are all from that September range. And this is that key. This is, I think, that key and the thing that will show you that this was a pennant race that was decided largely at the end of the season and involved two teams that were very, very neck and neck as far as the season went. We're not seeing a lot of games popping in here from like July or June or something like that. Maybe one from July that's way down here, right? And we can tell that by the game number as well. So there's all sorts of cool stuff that you can do in sorting this out left and right. This is sort of the theory that I have. I wish that we could play around with these stats more. If we could do a little bit more with Baseball Reference or with StatHead, we might be able to figure out some interesting correlations. As it stands now, I probably have to download a whole bunch of spreadsheets and mess around with it. I don't have the time right now, but that's kind of the way that it works. Now, when we look at how it's actually calculated, I have a few problems with this. I have basically one problem, and you know how I am. My problem is whenever you do anything arbitrary, right? So here we go. How is it calculated? This is on this Sports Reference blog. Let's look at Bobby Thompson's shot heard route in the world, the game we just looked at. Win for the Giants would clinch the pennant with a 50% chance of winning the World Series. Whether it was really 50% or not against the 1950 Yankees is also kind of up for debate. I think that we could probably get better chances than just it's a coin flip once you hit the World Series. But anyway, there's still a lot of work to be done. A loss would end their season, which gives you a 0% chance of winning the World Series. The difference between a win and a loss in this game is 50%. And then you divide that 0.5 by the baseline of 0.006. The baseline is explained here. We'll look at the baseline in a second. That means the Giants' championship leverage index for the game is 83.3 because it's 0.5 divided by 0.06. And then we can look at this for individual plays in the at-bat and then or in the game itself to get the leverage index. And that is calculated a little bit. I think it's more related to WPA. We'll look at WPA at some time in the future when I have a little bit more time to sort of take a look at this. And so that will tell you like how important this play was to a certain player, and you get certain championship winning percentage or winning probability allowed for winning, and you get certain taken away for losing, and on and on. That can kind of help you when you're looking at a player. I still think it's more interesting to look at a team than at an individual player when it comes to this because it's a team sport. My big problem here, though, comes from where this baseline of 0.006 comes from, right? So you click here, you'll get this page, win expectancy, and then you scroll down to championship leverage index. It explains this in general. CLI is normalized so the average game is equal to 1. That's good. In the case of CLI, 1 represents a game on opening day during the 2 wildcard format. During this era, the average game on opening day has a difference of 0.6 percentage points of World Series win probability. The reason why a particular error is needed as a baseline is because the importance that each regular season game has in a team's World Series win expectancy has decreased throughout history. That is correct. As the number of postseason teams and rounds has increased. That is correct. Do I like this? No, I think that's garbage, and I personally would rather just have a World Series and be done with it instead of all this postseason junk. But anyway, that's a call out to all the other old guys out there. I'm an old guy in my young age. But look at this. The 2 wildcard format era was arbitrarily chosen as a baseline, right? So you just told me here that you chose that a baseline is needed because the importance that regular season game on a team's World Series win expectancy has changed over time. But then you chose the current era as the baseline. How did you calculate this baseline? I bet we could go through and figure that out. Question number 1 is, how do you calculate the baseline? And question number 2 is, what if I went through the history of baseball and recalculated this using the original baseline for a team's win on opening day as the actual baseline for a game, right? Would that change things? It would change the number, definitely. I know that in terms of the stats, this is probably going to be arbitrary, but why? I mean, the question is, why did you use this as the arbitrary measure, the 2 wildcard era, which has been around for like a couple of years, instead of what has been around for the majority of baseball history, right? Why do we not use the era that the teams were playing at the time and the rules at that time and the difference in the average game opening day differential point as the baseline for those years, right? Why not have a different baseline for each year instead of using the same baseline for each era? In other words, the thing that I'm saying, and this will make some sense to you if you understand things, basic things about normalization and sort of what goes into sabermetrics, is that what you're basically doing here is you're saying you're going to judge the importance of every single game in baseball history as if they were playing in the 2 wildcard era, but they weren't. That's the problem. You need to use a different baseline because they weren't playing under the current era and under the current rules. Anyway, once again, we see in sabermetrics, even with a really cool concept that I think is really interesting and useful, we see this weird arbitrariness that comes in because reasons, right? And we're like, why? Why are we doing it this way? And where's the discussion about this? The discussion's not to be found. So we can discuss it here. We can talk about it if you want. I really think that Championship Leverage Index is actually very, very useful and very, very interesting. I would love to put it into some of these games we play with simulators. It can help tell the story of the season, right? I think it's a really, really interesting thing to look at. This is the sort of sabermetrics we should have. But why is it the case that every time I come into anything that's sabermetrically talked about and delineated and stuff, I come across some sort of stupid arbitrariness, right? And the other thing that we talk about here, and I'll end this with this one, is when we're talking earlier, we're talking about running 25,000 coin toss simulations of the remainder of the season twice for each team game. But that's not what you do. You told me right here that's not what you do. I mean, that's what you said, right? You said, no, the way that we look at this is the difference between a win and a loss is 50%. So if you win the game, you would clinch the pennant with this random, 50% chance of winning the World Series. That's how you got that the CLI of 83.33. There's nothing in here about flipping a coin 25,000 times, right? So this is my other point, right? Which is that if you're not doing it, don't claim that you're doing it, right? You're clearly not. Anyway, that's it. I got to take this phone call. I'll talk to you guys later. Talk to you then. Bye.